Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Now, the poll in the Times outlined what many have been thinking for a long time. It found that fewer than a fifth of voters saw the Labour leader Ed Miliband as a potential Prime Minister. Most Labour voters remain unconvinced by Mr Miliband, and it comes at an awkward time for the party, with many thinking that he may be too timid in the party's election manifesto. His leadership has indeed come under some pressure after his failure to respond directly to the measures of the budget. It spurred the chiefs of a number of Labour pressure groups, which included the Fabian Society, Policy Network and Compass, to sign a letter calling on Mr Miliband to be bolder and more radical. This comes in the same week of the funeral of that stalwart of the left, Tony Benn. His death came within a few days of that of the militant unionist Bob Crow, both typifying different sides of the left, which many see as Labour deserting a long time ago. But with more than a year out from the next general election, where does this leave Labour and where does this leave the left? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk. Also here is Joe Cox, researcher for the think tank Compass, and Richard D. North. He's a conservative commentator and author of the book The Right-Wing Guide to Nearly Everything. A warm welcome to you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. Ian, I'll start with you. First of all, I suppose it's strange, given that, as Ed Balls has pointed out, the average person is some £1,600 worse off than they were in 2010. Why isn't Labour capitalising on this?
I mean, Labour does have an extremely stubborn poll lead. Let's not forget. I mean, it's been there for quite some time. Occasionally the Tories chip away at it, and at the moment we're in that period where they've chipped away. So on the back of what was considered a successful budget, in fact it was utter nonsense, but you know, it was treated well by the press. They've managed to get to within about 1 point of Labour. I would predict now that within 2 weeks they'll be back with that sort of between 5 to 12 point gap between them and Labour. So, you know, while we can get quite carried away, especially on the stuff about whether Ed Miliband looks prime ministerial, a quality which he will never be able to secure, actually the polling stuff still remains relatively robust. And worryingly, no matter what changes in the economy, no matter what else changes in the political climate, that Labour poll lead stays there.
So you say the budget is nonsense. It was a matter of how it was spun afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, the Tory press we're about 18 months away from a general election. And the press, which is about sort of 3/4 Tory, and certainly in the parliamentary lobby, those journalists that work in Parliament have access to the Prime Minister's spokesman, it is overwhelmingly conservative. So already most of the press is ramping up onto a general election footing, and already it is treating political events in those terms. I mean, this was a very, pretty shoddy budget. I mean, the kind of budget where he was costing current policies by making cuts to future benefits. I mean, benefits that literally don't even exist yet. The kind of thing that if Labour tried to put that in a budget, they'd be torn apart by the press. But because it was Osborne, because it's 18 months from a general election, he was given a relatively easy ride.
Richard, a shoddy budget.
Well, it was a canny budget. I mean, Osborne's always extraordinarily deft. What's peculiar about it, in a way, is that we've got a radical pension reform, a direction towards a sort of libertarian point of view. Now, he's done it for canny political reasons to do with appeasing people who are about to retire, and they are rather flakily conservative at the moment. He wants them to be more strongly conservative. But what's surprising is that take away Ed Miliband's not being awfully attractive, if you like, in sort of vulgar media terms, Labour ought to be hugely successful. The left ought to now be hugely successful, and the beauty from my point of view is it surprisingly isn't. I mean, we've had a crisis in capitalism and we're in a recession. We're going to suffer huge welfare spending cuts. That ought to be awful for the Tories, and yet I think actually the Tories are kind of winning the argument big time, in the sense that political realities are lining up with economic realities. I think it's going to be very difficult for a modern generation of politicians to get out of sync with economic realities. That's a big shift in my lifetime.
Joe, what do you make of that libertarian freeing up of pensions and giving them back responsibility effectively? You don't have to buy an annuity now. You can go out and spend it on whatever you like. But this was a canny move, wasn't it?
I think it was a canny move. I think it was generally motivated by the idea that Osborne wants to squeeze out a little bit more growth before 2015, so that the Conservative Party are in a better position come 2015. The economy, if it's picking up by 2.5–3%, he can say, don't let Labour take over the wheels again. I think it's a very dangerous policy in lots of ways, because what it does, instead of the pension pots, what they do is actually pool risk. basically. And now what they're saying is, you're on your own. We trust you to do that, but you're on your own. We don't care if you buy a Lamborghini. Now, I think a collective, genuine left response would be, actually, pooling risk is a good thing. If we can plan together, save together for the future, then that would be a good thing. Labour's, again, seems a bit wrong-footed by that. They don't want to look like they don't trust people, but at the same time, they're not quite confident enough to make this argument about pooling risk, about, collective investment in the future.
And Ian, is that why the response from Ed Miliband has been so slow or non-existent?
Yeah, well, I mean, right immediately after the budget, it was non-existent. He didn't even refer to the budget. He just relied on about sort of 5 stock anti-Tory phrases. You can't trust him with the NHS. He stands up for the wrong people. That kind of stuff. He can say it in his sleep. What was more concerning, I mean, it's a tough gig, basically, because you're standing up after a very difficult, statements 1 hour long, lots of financial information. It's not easy to respond to that immediately. What was more concerning for me was that 24 hours later, Ed Balls still apparently had no policy on the pensions issue. So really that spoke to a much deeper malaise in Labour, which I think sort of corresponds to what the two of you are saying now, of like that the Conservatives are very ideologically, philosophically confident. If you look at what they did with an economic situation which should prove the exact counter-argument to their position, they owned it and they made it about Labour overspending, something, by the way, an argument which couldn't stand up at all. Actually, Labour has the reverse problem. It has almost no confidence in its convictions. And I think that really shows when you see something like this, like being willing to make an argument for pooling risk. It's just not even willing to go to that territory. So it finds itself constantly defensive, constantly thinking how much ground will it give to the right this time? As you're seeing, today on the welfare cap. Exactly the same issue.
It's extraordinarily difficult for them because Blairism is extraordinarily unfashionable, really, in a way, with everybody, apart from perhaps the odd right-winger like me. So that doesn't help the left, the broad left at all. That Blairism, which was practical modern socialism, if you like, as best we can fashion it. And then we have Tony Benn, the other Tony, dying. And a sharp reminder, if you like, that the heart and soul and even the mind of old left is, it's a horrible thing to say and untasteless, but as dead as a dodo. Where else do you go? Well, we're having a look at the idea of blue Labour and some sort of thing which is big society and which is slightly sort of anti-corporative and anti-capitalist and anti-globalisation, providing you can frame all those as being horrid. But actually, far too many people for Labour's liking actually don't mind all that.
Well, I would urge a bit of caution there, I think, because I think when you look at polling, say on nationalisation of utilities, the public remains very firmly left. I mean, of course, if you look at polling on capital punishment or immigration, they are very far to the right. I mean, the public typically don't think in political terms in the way that political commentators do. But I think in terms of heart and soul, when you look at, for instance, nationalisation of the railways, there is still massive public support for these issues. What there isn't is a parliamentary party with the bravery to make the case.
But that's because of a kind of bruising. People are bruised by the experience of the privatisation of things like the railways and gas companies because they're feeling it in their pocket in a way. It's not an abstract idea.
And are we dealing with reality when people say they hate the privatisation of the railways? If the railways work and are there, clean, nice, regular, what does it mean to be using them every day and yet saying you somehow wish that they were owned by some system you can barely remember what it was like? I think there's some fantasy about people ticking boxes for pollsters saying they don't like this and they don't like that. As you say, it might be that there's no one to vote for that would stand the other way, but I think Labour are dead right to be absolutely horrified at the thought that they could kind of follow that polling about, let's say, anti-privatisation back into state ownership.
Joe, I mean, in a week when the funeral of Tony Benn is to take place, does this make people feel nostalgic for the old left?
I think it absolutely does. I mean, I was astounded by the amount of people who were my age that felt that Tony Benn was an absolute inspiration. He performed a sort of role of sort of solace for a lot of us. I must say I'm 27 years old, by the way, because we sort of grew up in the New Labour years, and yet we spent our days reading the Tony Benn diaries as a sort of form of solace and therapy, really. To get back to Labour's standing right now, I think what people are crying out for from the Labour Party is something akin to a vision. And that doesn't mean a set of policies, but what it does mean is, well, what in 2020, if you elect a Labour government, what does your life look like? Is it any better, or is it just slightly less worse?
If you want the vision thing, then it seems to me that where the left is in deep, deep trouble is that the vision is very hard to frame if you've got, as it were, an entrepreneurial working class, insofar as you've got one at all, and one that aspires to be technically able and not the recipient of welfare and not taxed to pay for welfare. So the awful conundrum, which I think the Tories are reaching for more cleverly than Labour know how to, and Lord knows it's awfully difficult for the left to know how to have a new pitch, is to appeal to an entrepreneurial working class. In other words, a working class which is in effect disbanding itself by getting too well educated to want to go on being patronised by the state. Now that's a swine of a thing for the left to have to contend with.
No, I think it's absolutely right that basically one of the building blocks of, Tony Benn's day, what made Labour so strong was a working class, a sort of homogenous working class that worked in big factories. It voted Labour in its millions. It had power through trade unions. All that's gone. So how do you develop a left politics now, a vision of left politics, without that strong base outside of Labourism, outside of trade unionism? Lefties across the whole of the world are struggling with that. I think what it does mean is that you need a left vision which is environmental, which is about quality of life. It's about life outside of work. It means being bold on things like social security and thinking about things like a basic income, which allows people to be experimental but also acknowledges that you're not going to have one job for life. I think that's the sort of, the boldness that the left needs. Do
you think Tony Benn was something of an anachronism, because he came out of a time when there was a global socialist movement and there was a strong trade unions and all that kind of stuff, and he was kind of seen as quite an endearing figure in his later years, somebody who could relate to the average person, but not necessarily somebody who could come up with policies that would make his party electable.
He was always an anachronism. I mean, this is a man of the establishment. I mean, he was the first person to make sure he didn't go into, the Commons. I mean, he was a very strange, ahistoric figure. For younger people, they didn't see the firebrand Ben of, from the 70s and the 80s, and so what they got was this much more mellow figure that he was in retirement, where he was very concerned with civility and politeness. And he, frequently, one of the first times I ever saw him on television, he'd done this extraordinary speech, really hammering away. And at half-time, there's a queue of people waiting to talk to him. And one guy says, actually, I'm a Conservative. And and Tony Benn, the first thing he said was just like, I'm terribly sorry, and I hope I haven't said anything to offend you. And it was that sort of glorious lesson of, you can fight hard and you can always be civil and polite and decent, and that actually politeness is a form of egalitarian radicalness. It's how we create this sort of meat between the bones, and the bones being the vigorous political fighting that we do. So all of that was true. I mean, I am much more optimistic, actually, about what he represented in terms of people's political aspirations. And I actually think there's a lot more space than is currently being suggested around the table for a radical left-wing proposition in this country. Unfortunately, as I sort of alluded to before, the people who would support that, who would vote for it, would actually also be tempted by some quite radical right-wing propositions, for instance, like the return of capital punishment. But I do think that the popular ideas are there, that people are suspicious of the private sector just as much as they're suspicious of the state. There is work that the left can do, but it needs to have the bravery, the conviction in order to go down that road.
But Richard, also, I mean, not within a few days of the death of Tony Benn was the death of Bob Crow, the other side of the left spectrum. And I'm just wondering, the idea of leftism is somewhat confused, I suppose, because Bob Crow did actually understand he wanted, the focus clearly was improving the lot of the workers, but he wasn't anti-materialist, not necessarily anti-globalist in the way that the left is probably perceived as now, if you look at the global Occupy movements and so on.
Yes, and he's supposed to have been terrifically good for his members and robust for them, and he drew admiration from all sorts of people in death. It's all well and good for one or two trade union leaders in one or two very specific cases to be extraordinarily successful for their members. It's when they're running the whole country, in effect, that the thing becomes a bit unglued. Personally, I'm inclined to think that politics will shortly fragment in a way that it's been kind of waiting to for a long time. So the class warfare of cloth cap versus bowler hat, or whatever it used to be, and rich and poor, and managers and workers. I can't. Since that logic will collapse, I'd have thought the kind of organisation of parties around it ought sooner or later to collapse. And I think you could easily see the Tories splitting into all kinds of different things. And equally, to go towards the problem that the left might have is once it stops having to be a bloc, it could become far more interesting because all its different tendencies, from very radical to much less radical, its Blairism and its leftism and its trade unionism and its environmentalism, all these things could blossom. And I suspect that kind of shift, perhaps based on personalities, that we ought to be in an age when it's easier for MPs to become extremely interesting in their own right. So the Rory Stewarts, the Halfans, Robert Halfan, the Mark Field, to take a Conservative, extremely interesting individuals who can just about hang on to a constituency, represent it quite well, become a national figure. And who knows? I mean, the late Victorian period, the 19th century politics was not like 20th century politics, and it was more scattered. And there's no reason at all. In fact, all the technological drifts are towards a boutique politics, which would allow much more fragmenting, and the old left-right thing would rather collapse. And then all these things could blossom in.
You can see in that sort of vision, actually, that a split. Because I mean, really, when you look at the Commons, people in the centre of the Labour Party and the centre of the Tory Party have much more in common with each other than people in the Conservative Party have with their sort of, frankly, UKIP supporting backbenchers, or for instance, Dennis Skinner or something like that on the left of Labour. And it's not inconceivable within a relatively short period of time, a couple of decades, actually to imagine a sort of a centre-right grouping, especially if the Lib Dems continue to play their role as kingmakers in the centre, and actually seeing, the bulk of the Tory Party shift off to a much, actually, frankly, less electable place.
And Mr. Ganesh of the FT, who's a brilliant political commentator of our time, I think, writes, the peculiar thing about our coalition was that the Tories were supposed to be softened from the left, as it were, by their coalition partners, the Lib Dems. But hang on, it turns out that it's the Lib Dems that lobbed into the Tories the idea of pension reform, which is actually quite a libertarian free market idea. And so, hey presto, you get oddities in coalition which were completely unexpected. I mean, the Tories came in saying, what we won't do is touch the health service. They get into power in a coalition, feel completely free to produce a huge change. For good or ill, I'm not discussing. What I'm saying is that coalition, this thing of, we've spent lifetimes worrying about the awfulness of coalitions, of what would happen with fragmentation. My goodness, we'll be Italian.
What were we worrying about? Actually, just on the point of the Labour bloc, though, I mean, it was effectively kind of Joe Cox. I mean, Compass was one of the many groups that signed this letter, which basically called on Ed Miliband, or the Labour Party, the Labour Party in particular, to be more radical. Mm-hmm. Why did they do that? Because the letter was quite light on specifics, one could say.
There is a fear amongst many people in and around the Labour Party, within think tanks and within the broader community, that the Labour Party will go into the next election saying, you can't trust the Tories on the NHS, and we're going to sort out the cost of living problem, and not much else. When really, the scepticism about politics and political leaders in the country is now so profound that what you actually need is a real shift of power to ordinary people, because people feel powerless. They feel powerless at work, they feel powerless in their institutions, they feel powerless in their public services. So really, that was the idea of the letter, to get that across. That we want to see Labour going into the next election with a real bold vision about redistributing power to ordinary people and communities.
People always say that. I mean, and they're never specific about it. And even when they are specific, even when you've got someone like Blair saying, I'll do some reform, then they get into power and they never, ever, ever do it, because no one in power ever will.
And also, when you say, let's give power to the people, it always turns out to be giving power to a few grabby people who manage to get something looking like a representative group around them. And it turns out not to be power for the people. I mean, I am deeply conscious that it is a tremendous sadness that people are cynical about modern politics. And of course, I think it's to do with, the post-Beatle generation, which is my fault, and it's to do with the mass media, which is not my fault, and it's to do with the horrible cynicism of dreary things on publicly owned television, which calls itself satire, and which is just trite. But But since the problem with modern politics is not in the politicians, but in the voters, it's awful that we've got such a kind of automatic speak which says politicians ought to sort themselves out to get back in touch. No, actually, what we need is a revolution amongst young people to understand that politics was and is, right now, a splendid profession undertaken for the huge public benefit of this great society. And until we make that shift, we're going to go on having this whining about how we ought to be doing Twitter, not voting.
You're very generous to MPs. I mean, you earlier listed 3 very good MPs. I agreed with every single one of your choices. But you're still far too, because as a whole, they're extremely tedious, mediocre brains. That's and that's for good reason. That's because local associations do not pick people on the basis of their capacity for independent thought or their impressive. In Tory associations, they basically pick the person they'd like to marry their granddaughter. That's basically the guy who happens to be a bland, robotic, swivel-eyed loon at best. And then, in Labour associations, they pick, the most android-like, individual that looks like they've been created by some kind of factory process rather than by biology. So, you put these people in the Commons and people are surprised that there's not enough scrutiny, that the quality of legislation is not good. And it's frankly deeply unsurprising given the quality of people in it.
2 things I'd say about that. One is that since we've dangerously reduced MPs, our members of Parliament, to being constituents' gophers, we reduced them to being kind of social workers on behalf of individual constituents and their problems, which is a disaster on all kinds of levels, that doesn't help. But the other thing I would say is, well, I don't go to Parliament anymore, but I do watch quite a lot of it on television. I am that person who watches the Parliament channels broadcast from Parliament.
You're the one.
I am the one. I'm quite impressed. They seem most civilised, serious, thoughtful people. You don't expect the majority of the House of Commons to be visionary brain boxes. I mean, it would be awful if they were. I mean, of course they're much more like us than we want.
But wouldn't we want our leaders to be visionary brain boxes, Joe Cox? I mean, the point of, I'm just wondering, is it a problem of presentation for Ed Miliband? Because he has made some inroads, certainly tackling the energy companies, the big 6 and so on. It seems to be drowned out by the Conservatives constantly saying, we're cleaning up the mess that you left. And this seems to be having an impact because we hear it every week at PMQs, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is the infantilised way we talk about politics, right? I mean, basically in the media, everyone points all fingers towards political party leaders as if there would ever be one political party leader that could deliver everything for everybody in one political term. So ultimately we need to think about politics in a different way. I understand the cynicism about talking about redistributing power to communities and blah, 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 because we've heard it from the Conservatives around the big society. But the problem with the big society was essentially, in an age of cuts, what the big society ended up being is saying, we can't afford to run this local library. Would you like to do it? And people go, no.
But the Labour version of big society becomes, let's do lots of mutuals. And hanging over that this year is the failure of the co-op, which I agree is an extremely vulgar point for me to make. But I mean, it does sit there to be made. Mutuals turn out not to be that pretty
that's
either.
That's the problem with the co-op group, which is basically behave like a PLC and completely diverge from its cooperative basis.
I would concede to anybody that it is deeply wrong of my side, if you like, the Conservatives, to pretend that they hadn't signed up for absolutely everything that I can possibly remember of what Labour did that turned out to be totally disastrous. So that insofar as we had a banking crash and a recession, if I recall it right, Tories were cheering on exactly the same sort of nonsense, the big nonsense, that led to the disaster. And a little modesty on that front wouldn't go amiss.
Yeah,
but if you're in the mess, you want the Tories to dig you out. I mean, that pattern of once you're in a mess, which actually the Tories helped create or didn't do much to stop, then really only an Osborne is going to dig you out.
I have to say, even at the most, even people that would surprise you in the Tory party will concede, thank God it wasn't Cameron and Osborne in charge when the financial crisis happened. I mean, so, there's a sort of, especially in Westminster, there is a recognition of, actually, that was Gordon Brown's best moment of his career, and it was very important. And that they were actually extraordinarily petty later, where they wouldn't put him forward for the IMF job, which incidentally would have actually played to their advantages by neutralising the political threat from the IMF as well. you're right about the broader trend that you point to of, people think that the Tories get them out of economic trouble. If there's a recession, you'll get the Tories to dig you out. There's a flip side to that, which is that people almost never vote Labour unless there's at least 2% growth in the economy. So this idea that, by Osborne growing the economy, it plays into his, actually isn't necessarily true. What people tend to think is, get the Tories in to fix the economy. Once it's growing, get Labour in because they might actually give some of it to me.
Ian, what about the media? What role is the media going to play leading up to the election? Because Ed Miliband, he's taken on the Daily Mail. The Murdoch press don't particularly like him. You work for a neutral media outlet, relatively, politics.co.uk. How do you think what kind of impact will the media not liking Ed Miliband have?
I mean, they will go for him with a savagery that we have previously not seen. I mean, if you remember, after the first leaders' debate on TV last time round, the way that the Mail, and actually lots of the Tory press, went for Nick Clegg was at a level that we'd barely seen for a long time. And if you remember, the Mail thing was exactly what is it that makes him British. They were, digging up all sorts of things. Basically, Ed Miliband's got about 3 months of that to look forward to. They will absolutely go for him, not just because they're Tory supporting papers, but also now because he has quite explicitly said, I am not going to do what the press tell me to do. So actually, the press as a class are going to go for him. They're going to go for him very, very hard. It'll be next to nothing compared to what they do to him if he actually makes it into number 10, but that's another matter.
Joe Cox, the head of Labour's policy review, John Cruddas, is brewing his policy, bundles of policies, I suppose, which will be revealed in the fullness of time. What should he focus on, do you think?
Back to the theme about redistributing power to communities. I think a couple of examples of how you could seriously do that. Basically, 80% of money that's spent in local areas actually comes from central government. Now, if you start redistributing those pots to local areas and then actually inviting people in to say, how do we spend that money? I mean, there's examples of this in Latin America around participatory budgeting. And then what you try to do is give the impression that actually politics isn't about what happens in Westminster or us around this table. Politics is about what you can get involved in.
And he could also get the younger votes with possible change on tuition fees. Turns out that £9,000 a year, most of that isn't coming back.
I've heard that argument without really understanding it. I mean, since you're lent the money for as long as you need it, and as soon as you get rich because you've got a better education, you can start paying it back slowly. Anybody who wants to go to higher education without mastering that that's a good deal shouldn't be entering higher education, in my view. Part of the people, that's great until you get a very Labourish ambition, let's say, which is to do some big infrastructure. And all you get is NIMBYism on legs because you said to all the locals, oh yeah, if you don't want it in your backyard, we won't have a high-speed rail. Oh, forget that. We won't need that airport ever again. Because part of the people is extremely tricky. And in a small country like ours, you don't need to do it. We have a parliament which is sufficiently intimately in touch with the people, if only the people got off their backsides and made it so and understood that it already is.
Saying that we have a politics that even remotely appeals, I mean, I disagree. I think the level of alienation and disconnect now is potentially very dangerous, actually. And I think that's a failure not of the people, although they do have to take some of the blame, but really of the political establishment and its inability to talk in plain terms, in decent, normal terms. The flip side is, I don't believe for a second that a government would change this. And actually, if we can go back to that quote from Tony Benn, which he made over and over again, it's like, you take power as the public. No one ever gives it to you.
Is Ed Miliband, does he have the statesmanship to become Prime Minister? What do you think will play out over the next 12 months, Joe?
I think there will be a Labour-led government in 2015. The big question is it going to have a mandate to do radical things around green industrial policy, about, like I said, giving power away to communities? Is it going to do that? Is it going to make bold arguments about borrowing to invest in the social security that we need, in the infrastructure we need, or is it going to limp over the line?
Richard?
Well, we might have a Labour-led government next, and it might be as surprisingly peculiar as our Tory-led government has been.
And Ian, finally with you.
Ed Miliband will be the next Prime Minister, and he's going to have an absolutely torrid time for 5 years of having the press hammer away at him with a tiny majority, if any at all, and then he will leave, probably quite ingloriously.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. That's Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk, Joe Cox from the think tank Compass, and Richard D. North, author of the book The Right Wing Guide to Nearly Everything. Thanks for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London. Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Now, the poll in the Times outlined what many have been thinking for a long time. It found that fewer than a fifth of voters saw the Labour leader Ed Miliband as a potential Prime Minister. Most Labour voters remain unconvinced by Mr Miliband, and it comes at an awkward time for the party, with many thinking that he may be too timid in the party's election manifesto. His leadership has indeed come under some pressure after his failure to respond directly to the measures of the budget. It spurred the chiefs of a number of Labour pressure groups, which included the Fabian Society, Policy Network and Compass, to sign a letter calling on Mr Miliband to be bolder and more radical. This comes in the same week of the funeral of that stalwart of the left, Tony Benn. His death came within a few days of that of the militant unionist Bob Crow, both typifying different sides of the left, which many see as Labour deserting a long time ago. But with more than a year out from the next general election, where does this leave Labour and where does this leave the left? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk. Also here is Joe Cox, researcher for the think tank Compass, and Richard D. North. He's a conservative commentator and author of the book The Right-Wing Guide to Nearly Everything. A warm welcome to you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. Ian, I'll start with you. First of all, I suppose it's strange, given that, as Ed Balls has pointed out, the average person is some £1,600 worse off than they were in 2010. Why isn't Labour capitalising on this?
I mean, Labour does have an extremely stubborn poll lead. Let's not forget. I mean, it's been there for quite some time. Occasionally the Tories chip away at it, and at the moment we're in that period where they've chipped away. So on the back of what was considered a successful budget, in fact it was utter nonsense, but it was treated well by the press. They've managed to get to within about 1 point of Labour. I would predict now that within 2 weeks they'll be back with that sort of between 5 to 12 point gap between them and Labour. So, while we can get quite carried away, especially on the stuff about whether Ed Miliband looks prime ministerial, a quality which he will never be able to secure, actually the polling stuff still remains relatively robust. And
a direction towards a sort of libertarian point of view. Now, he's done it for canny political reasons to do with appeasing people who are about to retire, and they are rather flakily conservative at the moment. He wants them to be more strongly conservative. But what's surprising is that, take away Ed Miliband's not being awfully attractive, if you like, in sort of vulgar media terms, Labour ought to be hugely successful. The left ought to now be hugely successful, and the beauty from my point of view is it surprisingly isn't. I mean, we've had a crisis in capitalism and we're in a recession. We're going to suffer huge welfare spending cuts. That ought to be awful for the Tories, and yet I think actually the Tories are kind of winning the argument big time, in the sense that political realities are lining up with economic realities. I think it's going to be very difficult for a modern generation of politicians to get out of...
Worryingly, no matter what changes in the economy, no matter what else changes in the political climate, that Labour poll lead stays there.
So you say the budget is nonsense. It was a matter of how it was spun afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, the Tory press we're about 18 months away from a general election, and the press, which is about sort of 3/4 Tory, and certainly in the parliamentary lobby, those journalists that work in Parliament have access to the Prime Minister's spokesman, it is overwhelmingly conservative. So already most of the press is ramping up onto a general election footing, and already it is treating political events in those terms. I mean, this was a very, pretty shoddy budget. I mean, the kind of budget where he was costing current policies by making cuts to future benefits. I mean, benefits that literally don't even exist yet. The kind of thing that if Labour tried to put that in a budget, they'd be torn apart by the press. But because it was Osborne, because it's 18 months from a general election, he was given a relatively easy ride.
Richard, a shoddy budget.
Well, it was a canny budget. I mean, Osborne's always extraordinarily deft. What's peculiar about it, in a way, is that we've got a radical pension reform sync with economic realities. That's a big shift in my lifetime.
Joe, what do you make of that libertarian freeing up of pensions and giving them back responsibility effectively? You don't have to buy an annuity now. You can go out and spend it on whatever you like. But this was a canny move, wasn't it?
I think it was a canny move. I think it was generally motivated by the idea that Osborne wants to squeeze out a little bit more growth before 2015, so that the Conservative Party are in a better position come 2015. The economy, if it's picking up by 2.5–3%, he can say, don't let Labour take over the wheels again. I think it's a very dangerous policy in lots of ways, because what it does, instead of the pension pots, what they do is actually pool risk. basically. And now what they're saying is, you know, you're on your own. We trust you to do that, but you're on your own. We don't care if you buy a Lamborghini. Now, I think a collective, genuine left response would be, actually, pooling risk is a good thing. If we can plan together, save together for the future, then that would be a good thing. Labour's, again, seems a bit wrong-footed by that. They don't want to look like they don't